Welcome back to War Archive, your gateway to the untold stories of history's greatest battles and the mysterious folk tales that time almost forget. Like, share and subscribe and enter a world of war, mystery, and timeless. When the world began watching closely again. Wars rarely begin with gunfire. They begin with language. Before the first missile crossed the border, words had already crossed 1,000 rooms. Security guarantees, red lines, historical claims, spheres of influence. Maps were unfolded. Treaties were reread. Old fears were given new uniforms. For Ukraine, the war was not about ideology. It was about survival. About choosing a future without asking permission. I was not a soldier when it began. I was a logistics officer, trained to move supplies, not history. But history has a way of recruiting everyone. When the invasion came, it came fast, and it came with the weight of centuries pressing down on a single moment. The shadow of alliances. NATO was never just an alliance, it was a promise. And promises, when broken or delayed, are dangerous things. To the west, support flowed in measured streams, weapons systems, training programs, intelligence. But always with conditions. Always with pauses. Ukraine was armed, but not embraced. Protected, but not shielded. The reason was simple and terrifying. NATO membership meant Article 5. And Article 5 meant war with a nuclear power. Every shell fired on the front carried an echo far beyond the trenches. Each advance raised a question no one wanted to answer. How far is too far? The 28 points. The proposal arrived quietly. 28 points. Carefully balanced. Painstakingly vague. It promised ceasefires without guarantees, sovereignty without borders, security without alliances. It spoke of de-escalation while the guns were still warm. Some called it diplomacy. Others called it surrender with better grammar. For us on the ground, it was something else entirely. It was proof that the war had reached a level where the cost was no longer theoretical. The line that could not break. The front was frozen in more ways than one. Trenches cut through farmland once known for wheat, not wire. Drones replaced birds. Artillery rewrote the horizon daily. And still, the line held. I was reassigned as a courier, moving between units when radios failed or silence was safer. That was how I met Katerina, a field commander who believed wars were won not by firepower, but by endurance. She read the proposal once and handed it back without comment. Later she said, "They want peace without justice. That kind of peace never lasts." Allies without names. Support came, but never loudly. Unmarked vehicles. Advisors who never posed for photos. Intelligence drops that arrived just in time, and sometimes just too late. Everyone helped. No one committed fully. Behind closed doors, fear ruled the conversation. Escalation. Nuclear thresholds. Political backlash. Elections. On the battlefield, none of that mattered. What mattered was whether the next position could hold until dawn. The winter offensive. The turning point came in winter. The enemy believed we were exhausted. They believed diplomacy had softened our resolve. They were wrong. The counteroffensive began before sunrise. Snow muted movement. Darkness swallowed mistakes. We advanced through abandoned villages and shattered factories, reclaiming ground measured not in kilometers, but in lives. It was brutal. Close. Personal. I watched medics work until their hands shook. I watched soldiers stand their ground when retreat would have saved them. I watched courage become routine. The cost of holding. Victory never looks like triumph up close. We held the line, but at a price that followed us into sleep. Casualty lists grew. Faces disappeared. Names became echoes. Civilians paid the highest cost. Homes collapsed. Families fled. Every decision carried moral weight. Every strike required a calculation that could never be precise enough. Katerina insisted on restraint, even when it cost us tactical advantage. If we lose who we are, she said, we lose everything. Diplomacy under fire. As the fighting intensified, so did the pressure. The proposal was revised. Language softened. Conditions adjusted. The world wanted an end. But Ukraine wanted a future. NATO membership was still off the table. Too dangerous. Too provocative. Too final. Instead, there were promises of pathways. Of frameworks. Of eventual alignment. Words, again. The moment of choice. The final battle of that phase was not the largest, but it was decisive. An enemy breakthrough threatened to collapse an entire sector. Reinforcements were delayed. Support was uncertain. Katerina chose to hold. For 16 hours, the line bent but did not break. When relief finally arrived, the enemy had withdrawn. The front stabilized. The war had not been won, but it had not been lost. What the war leaves behind. When the guns fell silent, the silence was uneasy. The proposal remained unresolved. NATO remained distant. Europe remained tense. But something had changed. Ukraine had proven it could endure without guarantees. That it could fight without certainty. That its future was not a bargaining chip. I returned home months later. The city was scarred, but alive. Children played near sandbagged monuments. Life resumed, not because the war ended, but because it had to. When history demands a price. Wars do not end when treaties are signed. They end when memory fades. The debate over NATO, over peace, over risk continues in rooms far from the trenches. But on the ground, the lesson is already written. Security is never free. Peace is never simple. And the future is never given, it is defended. When the next proposal arrives, polished and persuasive, remember the cost already paid. Remember the lines that held. And remember that some nations do not ask to join history. They survive it. The battlefield was quiet, but the quiet was heavy. Snow drifted over trenches and craters, softening the ruins but not erasing memory. Smoke lingered stubbornly in the cold air. I walked along the ridgeline with Katerina at my side, her dark braid tucked under her helmet, eyes scanning for threats that were no longer there. Oleg followed, exhausted, hands still carrying the weight of the wounded. Towns were scarred yet alive. Children played cautiously near patched barricades. Survivors returned to homes smelling of smoke and soil. Life persisted, not because war had ended, but because it had to. Somewhere, diplomats debated alliances and peace proposals. On the ground, we had learned a different truth. Security is never free. Peace is never simple. The future is defended, argued for, and sometimes carried with trembling hands. Katerina spoke softly. Maps will be redrawn, treaties signed, but none will remember the cost. I looked over the battlefield, understanding. War leaves echoes, not in headlines or treaties, but in endurance, memory, and the unspoken promise that tomorrow will be defended, again.